Welcome, everyone. We're doing a deep dive today, really looking into understanding celebrity suicide and, importantly, how it gets portrayed.
Yeah, it's a sensitive one, but really crucial to talk about.
Absolutely. And we've pulled together quite a range of sources. We're looking at discussions from Hollywood Unapologetic, some ethical guidelines from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.
AFSP, right?
Yeah.
And also social media advice from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PMC.
Exactly. Plus, info from the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, the National Institute of Mental Health, an article from Nova Southeastern University.
Psychology Today has a piece too, and there's a Wikipedia entry on copycat suicide, which is relevant.
Right. And finally, a research article from the British medical journal, the BMJ.
So quite a bit to draw from.
Definitely. And our goal here is really to, unpack the complexities around celebrity suicide.
Yeah.
We want to explore how media attention can sometimes, sensationalize things.
And understand that phenomenon of suicide contagion.
Yeah, and figure out responsible ways to talk about it, ultimately aiming for, solutions and encouraging help seeking.
It's a lot to cover. That first source you mentioned, Hollywood Unapologetic. The title itself, Sensationalizing Celebrity Suicide, kind of sets a tone, doesn't it?
It really does. You can't ignore it. It immediately makes you think, okay, is the focus sometimes wrong? Does Hollywood, does the media lean too much into the shock?
Like focusing on the tragic details, maybe, instead of the mental health context.
Exactly. Instead of the underlying issues, which often seem to get lost.
And that source, it talks about a new Hollywood generation needing to think critically. That's just maybe the current way isn't quite right.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, does all that huge public interest, which Hollywood and the media definitely amplify, does it create this sort of problematic cycle after a celebrity death?
A harmful loop, maybe, where the attention itself becomes part of the issue.
Right. So could the media actually flip that? Could they focus more on, say, prevention, on the help that is available instead of just the spectacle?
Well, that leads right into why using multiple sources, like you outlined, is so important here.
Right.
The Hollywood Unapologetic piece points that out, too.
Oh, for sure. We can't just rely on one take. To really get a handle on why this is all so complicated, you need those different angles.
The ethical guidelines, the research data, the psychological perspectives, they all add layers.
Yeah, it helps us ask better questions, find maybe more nuanced solutions, which is the goal, right?
Absolutely. So let's dive into one of those big complexities. Suicide contagion.
Okay. Copycat suicide.
Right. Wikipedia explains it. Psychology Today talks about it. It's this idea that one suicide can, unfortunately, influence others, especially if it's highly publicized.
So the thinking is, hearing about a suicide, particularly a celebrity one, could act as a trigger for someone already vulnerable.
Precisely. And that's where the Werther effect comes in, named after that Goethe novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther.
Right. I've heard of that.
It refers to those documented spikes in suicides after a widely reported one. And it's not just isolated cases. We can sometimes see suicide clusters.
Clusters. That sounds quite alarming.
It is. Wikipedia breaks them down a bit. You've got point clusters, which are close in time and space, maybe in a school or community.
Okay.
And then mass clusters, which are linked in time, but not necessarily location. And those are often connected to media coverage, especially of celebrities.
And this Werther effect, it's not just an old literary reference, is it? I mean, the Wikipedia source says the book itself led to copycat suicides back then.
Yeah, and it was even banned in some places. It shows how powerful these narratives can be, even historically.
Wow.
And we have modern research backing this up. The PMC guidelines in Psychology Today mention a big 2020 meta-analysis. It found something like an 8 to 18% increase in suicides after celebrity suicide reports.
8 to 18%. That's significant.
But here's the really stark part. When the method of suicide was detailed in the reporting, the risk of suicide by that same method jumped by 18 to 44%.
Whoa. That's huge just from mentioning the method.
It is. And the PMC guidelines specifically bring up the Robin Williams case.
Right. I remember the discussion around that.
After his death, there was a reported 32% increase in suicides using the same method he did. That really focused attention on media influence.
And did the media follow guidelines then?
Well, the PFC piece notes that U.S. print media often didn't fully adhere to recommendations, like avoiding romanticizing the death.
So it's pretty undeniable that how these deaths are reported matters a lot.
Immensely. And the BMJ article reinforces this. It says there's substantial evidence linking media portrayals to suicidal behavior across news, TV, film, even books.
And what specifically makes reporting riskier, according to the BMJ?
They highlight describing the method, especially graphically. Dramatic presentation like big headlines, prominent photos. They also say younger people seem more susceptible.
And if the person feels they can relate to the person in the story,
That increases the impact too, yeah. So it's not just that it's reported, but the whole package, the details, the framing, the prominence.
makes sense. And Wikipedia adds more factors, right?
Yeah.
About reporting.
Yeah, it mentions that 2002 study finding influence from news, fiction, even things like suicide manuals, sadly. It talks about this feeling of permission someone vulnerable might get.
Permission, that's a chilling word for it. Like it lowers a barrier.
It can, yeah. And this links back to the Werther effect, often leading to suicides using similar methods. The more similarity the audience feels with the person reported on, the greater the risk.
Which explains why celebrity suicides can be so potent. We feel like we know them.
Exactly. And it's not just relating. Wikipedia lists other problematic reporting practices.
Like what?
Publishing the specific method, we covered that,
Mm-hmm.
but also romanticizing the death, especially for a celebrity, suggesting a suicide epidemic, glorifying the person who died, or massively simplifying the reasons behind it.
Right, making it seem like one single event caused it, which is rarely true.
Precisely. Presenting suicide as, I don't know, a glamorous escape or a way to finally get attention, that's incredibly dangerous. It's like offering a really distorted form of validation.
Yeah, completely twisted.
And Wikipedia also mentions the social proof model.
Social proof. How does that fit in?
It suggests people tend to imitate others they see as similar, even if the behavior isn't socially approved of. So if a celebrity they relate to dies by suicide, it might influence the how and who of copycat acts.
Huh. That's a different angle than just glorification. It's about connection, even in tragedy.
Right. But it's also important, as Wikipedia points out, that not all experts are 100% agreed on how consistent the evidence for copycat suicides really is.
Okay, so there's some debate. Or nuance.
There's nuance. While the bulk of evidence points to contagion being real, pinning down direct cause and effect in every instance is complex. Research is ongoing.
And we absolutely cannot forget the role of underlying mental health conditions. Wikipedia stresses that too.
Yes, hugely important. The stats, like 87 to 98% having a diagnosable psychiatric disorder, are telling. It's almost never just about one thing. Mood disorders, substance abuse, they're often part of the picture.
Which brings us squarely to the ethical guidelines, AFSP, PMC. They exist for a reason, clearly, because of this potential negative influence.
Exactly. And the PMC guidelines, developed partly after Chesley Christ's death, really underscore how even established journalistic best practices were sometimes missed, detailing the method, sharing note content.
And social media just spreads that faster, amplifying the risk.
Definitely. So the guidelines focus on things like language. Both AFSP and PMC say you used died by suicide or took his or her life.
Instead of committed suicide.
Right. Committed links to crime, to sin. It adds stigma. Using neutral language helps frame suicide as a health issue, which reduces stigma around mental health overall.
Makes sense. They also say avoid sensationalizing details, right? Graphic descriptions, the method, notes, location.
Absolutely critical. We've seen why mentioning the method is so risky. The focus should be on the person's life, their struggles perhaps, positive aspects, not the specifics of the death.
And if things like guns or bridges are involved.
Avoid describing how they were used in the death.
Got it. And the guidelines are firm. Don't blame suicide on a single cause. No, they died because they lost their job.
Right. It's always complex. Simplifying it gives a false impression and perpetuates myths that suicide is an inevitable response to hardship, rather than often preventable.
What about how prominently the story is featured?
Another big one. AFSP advises against front-page placement, top billing online. Avoid suicide or the method in headlines.
It's about minimizing the exposure, trying to counteract that contagion link.
Exactly. Same for TV and radio. And avoid alarmist language like epidemic. Use factual rates. Frame it as a public health issue we need to prevent.
And across all these guidelines, there's a constant refrain. Include hope. Include help.
Yes. Essential. The message that treatment works, that help is available. That needs to be loud and clear. Always provide the 988 Lifeline number, the crisis text line info. That's non-negotiable.
They also caution against interviewing survivors of loss or attempt survivors right away.
Yeah, partly out of respect for their vulnerability, but also to avoid potentially sharing distressing details that could harm others. Give people space to share their story when they feel ready, and in a way that feels empowering for them.
And for celebrity suicide specifically.
Even more caution. Avoid glamorization at all costs. Focus on their humanity, their struggles, what we know about their mental health journey, but don't speculate on the cause.
Highlighting that even successful people struggle can help break down stigma, though.
Definitely. And PMC specifically adds social media advice.
Mm-hmm.
Use content warnings. Don't share stories that ignore these ethical guidelines.
Yeah.
And absolutely no images of the scene or the deceased.
And finally, the duration of coverage matters. Don't keep hammering it.
Right. Repetitive, sensational reporting increases risk. Stick to informing, not dwelling endlessly.
Okay, so these guidelines exist. Do they work? You mentioned the BMJ article had examples.
It did. Some encouraging ones from Switzerland and Vienna, particularly around subway suicides. Collaborations between researchers and media led to less sensational reporting and, significantly, drops in suicide rates.
That's actually really hopeful. When guidelines are followed, it makes a difference.
It seems so. The BMJ piece also stresses including this in media training, calling out bad reporting. Awareness and accountability matter.
Which leads to the flip side of the Werther effect, the Papageno effect.
Ah, yes. The more hopeful counterpart. Wikipedia and Psychology Today both cover this.
This is when media shows people in crisis finding other ways to cope. Non-suicide alternatives.
Exactly. Named after the character in Mozart's The Magic Flute. It shows that positive portrayals, people facing adversity and finding help or solutions, can actually boost mental health literacy, encourage help-seeking, instill hope.
So media can have a positive protective effect.
It can. When outlets follow recommendations or even just reduce the prominence of suicide stories, the risk of copycat acts seems to decrease.
This helps frame why celebrity suicides hit so hard. That Nova Southeastern University article touches on this. We sort of equate fame with happiness, don't we?
We often do. It's a fundamental mistake, perhaps. We struggle to understand why someone who seemingly has it all would feel such despair. It doesn't compute easily.
And that feeling of connection we have with celebrities, even though it's mediated, makes their influence stronger.
Yeah, the NSU article calls it a quasi-personal connection through that virtual reality of celebrity. Their lives and deaths feel significant to us.
And the article reminds us again about Robin Williams, the spike in overall suicides, and specifically by the same method, strongly points to media influence.
It does. And it describes suicidality as this state of, tunnel vision, intensified by loss, alienation, feeling futile.
A painful irony, really, for people who are so well known to feel so disconnected.
It truly is. Which just hammers home the responsibility everyone involved in sharing this information has. Avoid sensationalism, provide resources. Always.
So let's talk practical steps. If someone is worried about a friend, a family member, especially after a big celebrity suicide story, what can they actually do? The 988 Lifeline has clear advice.
Yes, really valuable. Key things are, be direct. Ask openly if they're thinking about suicide. Listen without judgment. Show you care.
What about things not to do?
Don't act shocked or dismissive. Don't dare them. Crucially, don't promise secrecy if they're at risk. Offer hope, but be realistic.
And take action. Remove means, if possible, help them connect with help.
Absolutely. Getting them connected to professionals like calling or texting 988 is vital. And the Lifeline site also talks about active listening.
Really hearing them.
Yeah, not just waiting to talk, nodding, maybe reflecting back what they said so it sounds like you're feeling. Summarizing, using open body language. It makes a huge difference in helping someone feel truly heard.
And there are quite a few resources out there. 988, obviously.
Yes, and the Veterans Crisis Line, the Disaster Distress Helpline, all listed by 988 and NIMH.
And for longer-term help.
NIMH has great info. Talk to a primary care doctor. Look into federal resources like SAMHSA, national mental health organizations, maybe university resources or employee assistance programs. Lots of avenues for ongoing support.
And finally, something really important the 988 Lifeline mentions, support for people who've lost someone to suicide.
Absolutely essential. Bereavement after suicide is incredibly complex and painful. There are specific resources, support groups, therapists for loss survivors. They don't have to navigate that grief alone.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive really highlights, I think, just how intertwined media portrayals, especially of celebrity suicide, are with vulnerability in society.
Yeah, you hopefully walk away with a clearer picture of suicide contagion, the risks of sensationalism, and why these ethical guidelines and just responsible communication are so vital.
The need to shift the narrative towards prevention, towards highlighting support. It feels urgent. And remembering the simple power of asking, listening, connecting someone to help.
So maybe the takeaway for everyone listening is to think about how this shapes your own media consumption, your own conversations about mental health, what feels like the most critical piece in changing how we understand and respond to suicide. Starting point, really.
Definitely something to think about. A call for a more compassionate, more informed approach from all of us.